Colombia, Universidad de los Andes, winner of various grants and awards, important publications, and very prolific author in different areas connected with the research of this work group. One of the leading authorities in South America in the subject. It is a pleasure to receive you, Santiago. Without further ado, the word is yours.
Thank you. So I want to thank Gabriel, Renato, and all the organizers for putting together this workshop, which is a testament of their perseverance. But as you perhaps imagine, this is not just a matter of putting together a workshop. It's also a matter of forming community. And I think that's the most valuable thing, the fact that you have, people from all over the country and from overseas trying to create community. That's very valuable and something that I appreciate a lot. And I'm very happy to be part of that. Very happy, really. Okay, so I want to start by thanking not just the organizers, but also my collaborators. This is not working. Which window? Oh, yeah. No. Okay. Yeah, I just need to. Yeah, it's asking me to do some things in the computer. Hopefully it's going to work out like this. Okay. So I just need to click there every time. The clicker. This one's? Okay, I can use this. So I want to start by thanking my collaborators. This is William Jimenez, who's my colleague in psychology. He co-directs the Moral Emotions and Moral Judgment Lab that we run. And Sam Murray, who's one of our postdocs. So this is work that we've been doing for the last year or so. And also, some institutions that have supported our work. Okay, so here's an observation. When philosophers and scientists talk about our agency, we tend to be pulled by the dark force. So when we start thinking about free agency, we normally are drawn to questions about punishment and whether people deserve to suffer or not. When we start thinking about rational agency, it is often the case that we end up talking about irrationality. And when we start thinking about our moral agency, it's often the case that we start thinking about agents who do bad things. So I think there's some attractive features of the dark side, but I want to invite you to join me in thinking a little bit about the positive side of things. So here's one thought to begin. Moral agency requires that we live according to certain socially accepted norms, but moral agents oftentimes go beyond what is required from them, and they behave exceptionally well. Okay, so Picasso was not an ideal person in many respects, but he was clearly someone who did many things that were politically outstanding, exceptional, remarkable, things that were not required from him and that came at a high personal cost. Okay, and like Picasso, we find a lot of examples of people who behave exceptionally well, some of which are just sitting next to you. Okay, you don't have to be a moral saint to behave, at least occasionally, and to do things that are more than required from you. Now, there are two questions that this observation can raise, or at least two general questions that it can raise. Some questions have to do with motivation. So what is it that motivates agents to excel beyond what's morally required? Maybe they have a larger sense of duty than many of us, perhaps. Maybe it's in certain domains of their lives, or maybe it's just all across the board. So those are interesting questions, but are not questions that I will be addressing today. I'm more interested in questions that have to do with the evaluation of such behaviors. How do we go about evaluating those who go beyond what is morally required? Okay, that's the question the big question that I want to ask today. Okay, so there are certain things that are good, but are not required. And part of our evaluative practices will involve, if we want to capture this phenomenon, distinguishing the good from the obligatory. Or in some cases, distinguishing the bad from the impermissible. Let me just give you a quick example. So some people have, for environmental reasons, they think that eating meat is wrong. And maybe some of you think that's true. Okay, and oftentimes some of these people adopt a, meatless Monday policy. So you eat meat during the week, but on Mondays you decide, you're going to make an effort not to eat meat and thus contribute to the environment. So it's good for people to do that, but it would be wrong for people to adopt not the meatless Monday, but the theftless Thursday routine. So imagine that you are someone who steals from time to time, or maybe very often, and you decide, well, I'm not going to be stealing on Thursdays now. So there's would be a difference, I suppose, between the way we react between the two cases. We might praise the people who decide to adopt the policy of meatless Monday, but we kind of deride the people who adopt the policy of theftless Thursday. And part of the reason is to try to understand how that happens and why that happens. Okay, so that's part of what we're going to be doing. And here's the hypothesis that I want to convey. This is the big working hypothesis that I want to try to document as we move along, which is that underlying this evaluative possibilities, there are at least two different kinds of norms. There are, on the one hand, aspirational norms, and there are, on the other hand, imperatival norms. There's an aspirational norm, not to eat meat, and there's an imperatival norm, not to steal private property. Okay, there are different ways in which the aspirational and the imperatival have been carved out, but I think there are ways of carving it out that have showed up among psychologists and among philosophers, and I'm going to be talking about some of those ways in a second. Okay, so there are different kinds of norms, and what is a norm? Well, they kind of share expectations. Those expectations end up functioning as standards for negative or positive evaluation, and they have an impact on the attitudes that we have towards others and towards oneself. Okay, that's the basic setup of what we're going to be talking about. Now, notice that this is not the only way of accounting for this phenomenon. And there are some, competing hypotheses. I'm going to say a little bit about those hypotheses here, but I'm not going to spend most of my time showing why those competing hypotheses are not maybe the most promising ones. So one way taken from Kant is to distinguish between perfect and imperfect duties. So some people have tried to argue that when we talk about what I'm calling the aspirational, really what we're talking about is what Kant called imperfect duties. But I think that's not the right way of talking about it. I think what the aspirational and the imperatival are showing us and inviting us to think is about a contrast between two different kinds of normativity, one that is imperatival, deontic, and one that is not. So I do think that this framework of perfect and imperfect duties is not going to really help us capture what we want to capture. I'll show you some examples later of what I mean by that. Here's another way of thinking about it. So suppose that you have certain norms, and then you can approximate those norms and fall short or go beyond those norms. And then you do things that are good, but are not required for you. It's a different way of trying to capture the distinction. It's just one kind of normativity, but I find it's hard to capture many of the examples of aspirational norms in these terms. Okay, think about I'm going to give you some examples later. Okay, okay, so I told you we have this distinction This hypothesis, this distinction suggests this hypothesis. Let me give you a little bit of background to kind of motivate the work that we've been doing. So philosophers have been talking about things that are good, but not required for a very long time. And oftentimes, the phenomenon of things that are good but not required is glossed or explained under the heading of the supererogatory. So this is a term that goes back to Aquinas, at least Aquinas was one of the persons who developed this idea. And the thought was basically something like this. There are certain things that you're required to do as a good Christian, but there are other things that if you do in addition to those, will get you to heaven. Of course, Luther and the Reformation hated the idea of distinguishing the good and the required. And, kind of that distinction faded away for a while in philosophy until the 1950s. J.O. Urmson, an Aristotelian, published a paper in 1958, Moral Saints and Heroes, where he was trying to show that there is something of value here. He didn't use the term supererogatory. He talked about heroic actions or the actions of saints, but this is roughly what he had in mind. So Urmson's idea was we have the obligatory, the impermissible, and the permissible, but those three categories are not sufficient to capture some acts that are heroic. Heroism is not obligatory, clearly it's not impermissible, and as he would put it, just saying that it's permissible doesn't capture the moral value of it. Okay, so he thought we needed further category to account for, our moral practices and a moral reality. Roderick Chisholm, a few years later, came up with a similar idea. He was saying, well, there are ways in which we classify actions, but most of our theories so far have missed this important categorization. Actions that are good to do, but not bad not to do, which was his gloss to the, supererogatory. Slightly different from the Urmson line, but very much in line with those things. And then came Julia Driver in 1992. Apparently, if you want to be a good ethicist, you have to have cool glasses. And she said, well, in addition to the supererogatory, there's the suberogatory. So things that are bad to do, but are not impermissible. Okay? And in a way, she was, arguing with Chisholm in this regard. She was saying, if you focus on the supererogatory, you might find this category, but there's also the suberogatory. Actions that are bad to do, but in doing those actions, you're not violating any of your moral obligations, as it were. Okay? So this is a distinction that has some history in philosophy, and it's unfortunate that it has not really made its way into the psychology of judgment. So we have different ways of trying to include things like the supererogatory in developmental psychology. We have some of that. But what we know about moral evaluation or theory of moral judgment, not much attention has been paid to the notion of the supererogatory. So here's one reason why psychologists have not paid a lot of attention to this. For many of them, either explicitly or implicitly, the categories that are necessary to frame even the phenomenon of the supererogatory are just mean the same. The good and the permissible, or the good and the obligatory, the good and the obligatory just simply are the same thing. Okay, so different ways of trying to convey the same idea. Many of them, as I said, have endorsed this view without really explicitly acknowledging. But there are a few studies where people have actually put forward the view. So they use certain words of moral evaluation, what's obligatory and what's good, in interchangeable ways. Now there's some reasons why people do this. So one reason has to do with the use of deontic logic. So if you incorporate the framework of deontic logic, all these categories are going to be interdefinable. That's one thing. And, some people have argued that actually when you use different categories, the wrong, the inappropriate, the forbidden, the blameworthy, you don't get, significant differences in your results. Which, to a certain degree is true. There are many cases in which, using one of these categories is not going to provide any difference. So why that is the case, this is a little bit of speculation. Okay, Bertrand Mallet, he does think, he's an exception. He does think that these things are different, but he doesn't provide evidence for that as empirical evidence. It's basically mostly based on first principles. Okay, so why is this? Why is it that you don't find, if you replace the wrong with the appropriate or the forbidden or the blameworthy, why is it that you don't find significant wording effects? So here's one possible explanation. So a lot of the work that people have been doing in the psychology of moral evaluation and moral judgment includes the use of dilemmas. Probably dilemmas are one example, but they're dilemmas. And usually what dilemmas do is they pit requirements once against each other. Okay, so if you're pitting requirements once against each other, it is, likely that you're going to find dissociations between, say, what's good and what's obligatory, on what's bad and impermissible. Just simply the way the materials have been used are not materials that allow to see that dissociation in very clear light. Now, why have we been using this sort of materials? Well, further 1 minute of speculation. Well, it has to do with the kind of moral theories that have informed actual psychological research in moral judgment. There are theories that, for the most part, do not allow for a distinction between the aspirational and the imperatival. Okay, so what we want to do is to, start thinking about the difference between the aspirational and the imperatival, show that effectively, that is a difference that frames the way our moral cognition works, and that it has significant differences in the way we evaluate each other and end up, having attitudes towards ourselves and to other people. So the first thing that we need to do is to try to show that these are actually different categories, that we can find situations in which we can dissociate the different categories that are involved and that make possible the distinction between the aspirational and the imperative. So I'm going to show you a couple of studies where we are trying to do that. So one first challenge in designing those studies is to come up with the materials that will help you do that kind of work. But fortunately, because there has been some philosophical discussion of the supererogatory and the suberogatory, we were able to use some of those discussions and some of the examples used there to build on some of our vignettes. So these are two of the vignettes that we're going to be using here, and both of them are taken from Julia Driver's examples. I'm going to read just one of you to you, the newlyweds. Two newlyweds are boarding a plane to go on their honeymoon. Because of a booking error by the airline, the couple does not have seats together. They ask someone already seated if they would switch seats so the couple could sit together. One scenario, the passenger switches seats and the newlyweds can sit together, the supererogatory. Other scenario, the passenger does not switch seats and the newlyweds have to sit separately, the suberogatory. That's Julia Driver's example. A little bit, no, that's actually literally her example. So what we did is we constructed vignettes along these lines. We had at least 4 vignettes, and we started, just piloting those vignettes and showing people what they think about what the different actors did or failed to do in different occasions. And people would effectively describe, the behavior of the different actors and using terms like obligatory, permissible, good, bad, etc. Okay, so that gave us, the basic idea for our, first series of studies. So we had, 95 participants. It was more of an exploratory study. We have 4 vignettes, one with a supererogatory, the suberogatory, each of them with super and suberogatory, and we tried to balance actions and omissions here, thinking that that would make a difference, but final option doesn't make a difference, so I'm not going to be talking about that. And we just gave people a choice. This was their task. We present them with different options: permissible, impermissible, required, good, obligatory, allowed, bad, optional, compulsory. These are the words that came out in our pilot. And we just asked them to select as many words as they could that they thought would represent what they thought about the situation. Okay, so here's essentially the layout. This is not the newlyweds, but the kidney one. Alex is suffering from severe kidney failure, and Alex's only hope is to obtain a transplant kidney. Alex's cousin Jamie is the only known compatible donor. Jamie does not offer to donate the kidney to Alex. And then they have to choose from any of the boxes here. It's a very simple exploratory study. We wanted to confirm some of the things that we had, well, not just confirm, but just like have a little bit of a basis of the things that we have seen in our pilot. So here are the results. It's kind of a difficult table to read, but it's not too difficult. Let me just walk you through two relevant things. So if you look at the bars here, you can see the height and the width of the bars. The height indicates which words or which categories were more commonly used. So allowed, optional, permissible, good, and bad were commonly used. Compulsory, impermissible, obligatory, and required were used to a lesser degree. And if you just focus, say, on the good, well, you see that most of the usage of good have to do with the supererogatory. Most of the usages of bad have to do with the suberogatory. Okay, so people do seem to be capturing and seeing the difference between the super and the suberogatory, and they're kind of marking that difference with good and bad, permissible, impermissible, and optional, and more or less obligatory. Okay, so that gave us some idea as to where to move next. Okay, so we started our first confirmatory study. We have 311 participants. Again, these were prolific participants. And we had the same vignettes that we had before, okay, giving a combination of supererogatory, action, and omission. And this time, we asked participants to evaluate the situation along different dimensions using a sliding scale. Permissibility, goodness, obligatoriness were all measures here. Okay, so essentially the layout looked something like that. You just read the vignette, move the slider from the impermissible to permissible, bad to good, optional, non-obligatory, with a midpoint that was neither one nor the other. So here are results, which actually confirm what we were trying to go after. People do distinguish these different categories. So if you look at the darker bars, people tend to evaluate those actions, which are the suberogatory, as bad, at least worse than not good, not bad, more optional than not, and more permissible than not. And if you look at the supererogatory, they tend to be classified as good, again, as optional, and then as permissible. Okay, so that was our first real confirmation that actually in people's minds, at least in certain scenarios, the good, the obligatory, and the permissible just move along different dimensions. Now we run, similar studies with other, of the wordings that were relevant for us. But here's just another one to give you. It doesn't, same method, same thing. This time it was not good, bad, but right, wrong, just in case you would see a difference here. And it turns out that it looks very much like the plot that we had before. Okay, so that's our first study. People distinguish the sub and the supererogatory. They kind of have a sense of how that distinction goes, and they dissociate, or the usage of these categories dissociates good, the obligatory, and the permissible. Okay, so one question that was asked to us, that we were asking ourselves, and that has been asked to everyone who tries to defend the existence of the super and the suberogatory, is whether those are real moral categories. So here's one way in which the objections can go. Well, you have the situations where people are not properly polite, but politeness is not the same as being immoral. When it comes to real morality, then you're not going to find the distinctions between what is good and what is obligatory. Okay. So we knew we needed to play a little bit with our vignettes and have a different set of vignettes where actually we were offering people situations in which the moral concerns seem to be at the offer. The moral concerns seem to be at the front of the table. Okay, so we started looking at different works in philosophy again, and we constructed some vignettes out of some well-known philosophical examples. So this is J.J. Thomson, and she has the famous, violin player example. So we have one vignette of that sort. So it would be supererogatory. You stayed hooked up to the violinist, but it would not be required. That was our thought. And you have this also different kind of example used by Bob Nozick in talking about property rights. I'm going to tell you about the example in a bit. So here's roughly how Nozick example goes. I'm not going to go through J.J. Thomson example because I assume that many of you know about it. It's a little bit long, but here's the way it goes. Jones finds a large freshwater source on his property, so he digs a well as a way of claiming the water. A few weeks later, the town where he lives begins experiencing a drought, which was completely unpredictable. Town representative visit Jones to ask whether they can use his water to alleviate some of the drought. Without Jones's help, the town will likely run out of water in a few days. If Jones donates some of his water, however, he might experience the effects of the drought in the unlikely event that the drought prolongs for too long. After considering what to do, Jones decides to offer his water, the supererogatory, or declines to offer his water, the suberogatory. Okay, so again, this is kind of a moral situation. We're talking about property rights. Actually, this is an example brought by Bob Nozick to talk about property rights and the role that property rights play in a theory of justice. So again, we use the violin vignette and the well vignette, and we brought the newlyweds vignette with us just to see how the three of them compare. So again, we got 300 and something participants from Prolific. We have the three different vignettes: the violinist, the well, and the newlyweds. And everyone saw the super and the suberogatory. Participants evaluated the situation along different dimensions using the sliding scale. You know this already: permissibility, goodness, and obligatories. And this time, we also gave them a further item, an item about blameworthiness, people being blameworthy or people being praiseworthy. So, and here are the results, the aggregated results on the left side of your screen. And again, we find the same dissociation that we find before. So people think that the suberogatory is more bad than neither bad nor good, more obligatory than neither obligatory nor permissible, more optional than non-obligatory and permissible, and obligatory, blah. They find both the sub and the supererogatory more permissible than not, and they tend to find blameworthy the agent in the case of the suberogatory and praiseworthy in the case of the erogatory. And if you look on the right side, you get the results just not aggregated by single out by each of the vignettes that we use, and they look roughly similar, the three of them. Okay, so what have we done so far? So we've shown that people can dissociate, at least they have the conceptual machinery to distinguish these two different kind of normative domains: the aspirational and the imperatival. And what we want to see is whether the ability to use and to dissociate those concepts translates in the way they evaluate others, differences in the way they evaluate others, and they have attitudes towards others and towards themselves. Okay, so we want to see whether we can actually find evidence for the existence of these two separate and different normative domains. Okay, so again, go back. So the claim was that we have this difference between the aspirational and the imperatival. And at least with the aspirational and the imperatival, we can say this: violations of the aspirational are wrong but permissible, whereas violations of the imperatival are wrong and impermissible. Okay, so we had used so far a couple of, at this point, 6 different vignettes. And clearly there are just 6 different vignettes, and we wanted to show and see whether this is actually This distinction was one that people massively use, and if we can cover a variety of moral situations. So here's what we did. We invited 111 participants to work with us, again in Prolific, and we just presented them with 190, well, we just presented each of them with 50 descriptions of norm-violating events. And we just took those descriptions for different questionnaires that have been used for moral evaluation in the theory of moral judgment. So the moralization in everyday life scale, the moral foundations vignette, moral debatable behavioral scales. And we just picked some that we thought might be useful in this regard. And we included, descriptions of norm-violating events from our vignettes, okay? And essentially, following a standard procedure, we just presented each description with you see, you hear about. So you see that someone fails to offer her kidney to, the cousin who needed it. Or you hear about your partner having sex with someone else when you're out of town, okay? Just presented them with those violations. And we just asked them, so after presenting those violations, we gave them two statements. This person did something morally wrong. This person did something morally permissible. And we asked them to rate their agreements with respect to those statements. Okay, so we wanted to find out from all the lists that we have, those where we can clearly see dissociations between the wrong and the permissible or the obligatory, whatever we can find here. Okay, and that gave us a new set of materials to work with. Okay? So we found that in this piloting that many of the statements would allow for these distinctions between what's morally wrong and what's morally impermissible. And we just took some of the statements that best work and started working with those. And that's what you're going to be seeing in the studies that are going to come next. Okay, does that make sense? Again, we're trying to build materials because there are no materials out there. So we're trying to see what people are giving us as suitable materials for doing this. So here's this next study that we did. It's 166 participants. We took the 20 descriptions of norm-violating events that were taken from the pilot. 10 of them were aspirational and 10 of them were imperatival. That is to say, to 10 of them, people would say it's wrong and impermissible. And to the other 10, they would say it's wrong, but not impermissible, okay? And we took those descriptions and asked people to answer 4 questions. To what extent do you consider this behavior to be morally wrong? To what extent do you consider this behavior to be morally permissible? To what extent do you think it's okay to blame the person? To what extent do you think it's acceptable to punish the person? Okay, we asked these questions for the aspirational and the imperative. So it looks something like this. I don't know if you can see, but I hope that you can. At least you're not. Sorry? Okay, so I don't have to do anything. Good. I cannot do too many things at the same time. So here are our results. So you got this box here, and you got a line on the top and a line on the bottom. So the line on the top, you got the results from the imperatival, the violations of imperatival norms. So you got way to the, you go way to the right, to the left, ratings for permissibility. So are these other things that people do here permissible? And people tend to say that they're not permissible at all. And they tend to see them as being wrong, punishable, and the people and to assign blame to the violators. Okay, so you find this on the one hand, the fact that they're impermissible, and the harsh judgments about the action itself and the agent. Now you find it very different thing when you look at the aspirational. Okay, so are these violations permissible? Now the ratings are close to the midpoint. Punish, just lying there in the midpoint. Interestingly, okay, people think that they're wrong, somewhat wrong, and people tend to blame the actor. So the actor deserves some blame. What the actor did was, was wrong. Not clear if it deserves some punishment, but clearly what the person did was, permissible. Okay, so you get this association between the imperatival and the aspiration, different ways in which people evaluate these behaviors, according to which the norms are imperatival or aspirational. Okay, so that was norm violation, but we want to see whether norm compliance, we would see similar things. Okay, so again, we did exactly the same thing, 195 participants, 20 description of norm compliant events, the ones that we had before, and we ask roughly, the analog questions here, to what extent you consider this behavior to be morally right, morally permissible, to what extent do you think it's okay to praise, and to what extent do you think it's acceptable to give credit. And again, we see some interesting differences here. Again, the top is about compliance with imperative. The bottom is compliance with aspirations. Okay, so you see that when it comes to the to doing, what duty requires, people think that is right. So you see the purple one over there on the very right. People think it's obligatory, but people don't think that the agent deserves much credit or much praise. Where you come to the aspirational, people think that is more permissible than obligatory, non-obligatory than obligatory, but all the rest of the ratings are on the top, on the right, on the far right. So people think that the agent deserves high praise, that what the agent did was highly right, and that the agent deserves a lot of credit for what they did. Okay, so we find this interesting asymmetries of action and agent evaluation, depending on whether we're thinking about imperatival norms or aspirational norms. And that's what we get from these pair of studies. Now, here's another question that we wanted to ask. We wanted to know how encompassing this distinction is. We wanted to know whether there's a little corner of morality where the aspirational and the imperatival live, or whether you can generate, or you can see this distinction between the aspirational and the imperatival as being part of the larger landscape of morality. Now, nobody knows how big or how small or what the topology of morality looks like, but at least we have certain ideas of what, at least some of the components that are there. And some of those ideas can be taken from moral foundations theory, I think. So moral foundations theory has this, many problems and complications, but I think there's a bottom line, one interesting thought about it. That if you think about morality, you can think about problems that have to do with morality as dividing or going along 5 different dimensions: dimension of care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. And the idea here is that morality evolved to certain kinds of problems, and there are problems that demand, solutions that are associated with care or disallowing harm, solutions that have to do with justice, solutions that to problems that have to do with your relationship towards your peers or others or institutions, relationships towards authority, and things that have to do with sanctity. Okay, so you can see, this is, moral foundation theory in one slide. It's just telling you what the different foundations are. Okay, so we try to use moral foundations to see how moral foundations theory and this idea that you can think about different problems that arise in the domain of morality as a way of seeing how encompassing the distinction between the aspirational and the imperatival is. At least that's what we're trying to do in this study. Okay, so we have 135 participants from Prolific, and we take 30 descriptions of norm violating events, 6 from each of the 5 foundations. Remember, most of these items were coming from one version or another of the moral foundations theory. We asked participants 2 questions, the questions that we are interested in. To what extent do you consider this behavior to be morally wrong and morally permissible? And after that, we asked them to go in a classification task, basically to tell us whether the violating events would belong to one category, one of the foundations, or a different foundation. And we offer them the choice between the different 5 foundations that are part of moral foundations theory. So it looks exactly like this. You see a man telling his fiancée that she has to switch to his political party. And then you ask about permissibility, you ask about wrongness. And after that, this is the kind of task that participants have to complete. So why is this action morally wrong? It's not morally wrong, or it violates norms of harm, care, fairness, justice, authority, purity, freedom, etc., etc. Okay? So that gives us a way of seeing whether the distinction between the aspirational and the imperatival can be found in the different dimensions. And this is the results that we have. So clearly you see a dissociation in the sanctity foundation, in the justice foundation, the authority, the liberty foundation. So we got some, and we don't see one in the care foundation. And part of what we are trying to do now is try to find out why I don't see one in the care foundation. It might have to do with the items that we use. A lot of the care items where we saw the big dissociations that we care about were items that had to do a lot of with animal harm. So that might be a reason why the results are working the way they're working. But we need to think about that. Okay, it might turn out that the difference between the aspirational and the imperatival is not part of the care foundation. And there would be some reasons for thinking that that might be the case. Or at least it's not as pronounced in the care foundation as one would think. Okay, so that's, we've shown that people have the concepts to distinguish the aspirational and the imperatival. We've shown that when people evaluate other violations and compliant behavior, their evaluations of in the imperatival case are different from the evaluations in the aspirational case. And we've seen that these differences can be seen in the different foundations. So one question is whether they are actually socially relevant or not, whether the aspirational and the imperatival makes a difference in the ways in which we are disposed to relate to others or relate to ourselves. Okay, so different study and final study. 133 participants on prolific. I'm okay with time. 133 participants on prolific. 2 blocks of 20 descriptions of norm violating compliant events. So it was randomized, but then some people saw the 20 norm violating events first, and then the norm compliant events later, or the other way around. And we're asked 2 sets of questions, each for a different block. Here are the questions. So the first one is actually 1 share, although the scale is slightly different. You're going to be seeing in a second. It's a self-esteem question. If you were to behave this way, how would you feel about yourself as a person? See? There's an avoiding questions. To what extent would you avoid someone who behaved like the person in the example? This is for cases in which people are seeing violations. And in place of compliance, we have a friendship question. To what extent would you be willing to befriend someone who acted this way? Okay, so this is how it looks like. You see someone offered to help a coworker so they don't need to work late. Presumably I think that's aspirational. If you were to behave this way, how would you feel about yourself as a person? Not good at all, neutral, not good, neutral, not good, decent, good, somewhat good, excellent. To what extent would you be willing to befriend someone who acted this way? Not at all willing, somewhat willing, completely willing. That's for the aspirational, and here for the imperatival. Violation, sorry. If you were to behave this way, how would you feel about yourself as a person? Those are the violations. Not bad at all, mediocre, somewhat bad, bad, horrible. To what extent would you avoid someone who behaved like this person in the example? No avoidance, somewhat avoid, and completely avoid. And this is the results that we got. So if we focus on the compliance cases, so in the top, you see the violation cases. In the bottom, you see the compliance cases. If you look at the violation cases, so if you see someone violating an imperative, lying, cheating, then you'll tend to avoid that person. And if you imagine yourself doing that, you feel really bad about yourself. Whereas if you fail to comply with an aspirational norm, you don't feel too bad about yourself, or not at all bad. And maybe you wouldn't be disposed to avoid the person who you saw doing that. Okay, with compliance, again, we see that with the difference between the imperatival and the aspirational. So if you see someone telling the truth, if you see someone paying their taxes, well, then, you might be somewhat willing to become friends with that person. If you imagine yourself doing those things, you would consider yourself a decent person. But on the other hand, if you were to comply with aspirations, you would feel yourself like a really good person, and you would be much more willing to befriend a person who you saw doing that sort of thing. Okay, so those are the studies that I want to present to you, and here are some conclusions for discussion. So I started with an observation. The observations that moral agents often go beyond what is required from them. And the big question is, how do we go about evaluating these agents and what these agents do? And here's a summary of what we thought about. So we've tried to argue that if we think about how we go evaluating agents who do this sort of supererogatory or suberogatory actions, we can see that behind that there's a distinction between two ways in which normativity shapes our life, the aspirational and the imperatival, between aspirational and imperatival norms. So we saw that people, first of all, distinguish the good, the bad from the obligatory and the impermissible. We tried to argue that the distinction points to different evaluative standards, which we can see in terms of the evaluative asymmetries between action and agent that we see in the case of the imperatival versus the aspirational. We see that the distinctions generalizes perhaps not to all, but to most moral domains. So it's kind of a moral encompassing distinction. And we see as well that violations of compliance motivate different attitudes towards self and towards others. There are further questions that we need to address, and we need to think more about those. Presumably there are more than the ones that I'm going to list here, but here are some representative ones. First one is, why do we tolerate, that is not require, things that we recognize as bad? Is there something common to all supererogatory behaviors or to all suberogatory behaviors? In the case of suberogatory behaviors, maybe the effort that the agent makes in order to behave well, or the costs that she incurs. And can we give a functional account of this distinction? So if morality is supposed to be evolved to solve certain kind of social problems, what are the social problems that might or might not explain this distinction? Finally, we also want to ask whether there are other kinds of norms. So we've talked about the aspirational, we've talked about the imperatival, but maybe there are other kinds of moral norms that we need to understand better if we want to have a nicer picture of the landscape of moral cognition and moral evaluation. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Santiago. That was very well organized content, and let me praise you for being the first talker that has not extrapolated the time. And even though you put up a lot of good evidence in this talk, I mean, I'm gonna break the protocol and I'll go for the first question myself. I never had the precedent because I have to give word to the people, but it's a very simple question, and it is a question of conceptual clarification, right? You use, like, I think you have used like something like 16, 17 times the adjective subrogatory. But when you're thinking of something that is subrogatory, what kind of subrogation is involved on that? Because subrogation in common law systems is something very specific. It's a concept that in Latin-based Roman inheritance law systems is not very common. In the US, England, Australia, they have very clear concepts of subrogation. What is exactly the concept of subrogation? There is playing a key role here? Is it more a lay people concept of a third party involvement, or are you accounting for the subrogation concept in the terms of common law in Anglo-Saxon countries? That's my question.
Okay, so let's see. Thank you for the kind words. And I don't think I'm accounting in terms of common law, right? Because if I were to, I don't know anything about law to be able to do that. Okay. But I'm trying to say, so of course people don't have the concept, as it were, or the word for the supererogatory. But you know, philosophers have that word, and they use that word to describe a certain phenomenon in a moral domain. Okay. One question, it's a normative sort of question, or at least a question in mathematics, is whether the phenomenon exists or not. Okay. Another question is whether people actually evaluate behaviors in ways that are consonant with the philosophical concept of the supererogatory and the suberogatory. Okay, and I think what we've been trying to argue is that people actually do judge and evaluate behaviors in ways that are consonant with that concept. And what that explains their evaluation there is the presence in their moral cognitions of this distinction between the aspirational and the imperatival norms. That's the claim. Okay, so no law, but if there's anything that I should be learning about common law that would help me here, I would be very grateful for.
So thank you. That was really interesting. And I'm stuck on something very early in the talk. So it sounded as if, especially when you were describing Julia Driver's work, that the suberogatory is sort of a mirror image of the supererogatory. But it seems to me that there's an interesting asymmetry there, and I wonder whether you've explored it or whether I'm wrong about it. So it might be worth going back to the vignettes that you started with the kidney and the airplane seat. So in the airplane seat scenario, when somebody gives up their seat, you know, I think that's a kind of maybe supererogation. And if they don't give up their seat, you think, you know, like that person's a real, you know what, because it really wouldn't cost them very much to change seats. But I don't think that the kidney story is parallel. I think that that's certainly supererogatory to give up your kidney, but I don't think that, who is it, Jamie? Jamie, is it all blameworthy to not do it? I mean, the cost is very high, potentially. And so I don't see that as, so there I don't think there's the supererogatory and the suberogatory. And I don't know what the other prompts are like and whether they're, you know, things that are more parallel or more asymmetric, but I'm just wondering whether you notice the asymmetry and whether you think there's something important there.
Yes, thank you. So we tested 4 different vignettes. There's a newlyweds, there's a kidney, there's one when someone wins a raffle, and this person doesn't care much about the prize and has the choice of taking the prize or donating to a charity, whichever charity, and the person says, yeah, I'm going to keep it, I want it. Yeah. So there's a newlyweds, there's a kidney, there's the raffle, and there's another one that I'm forgetting right now. Okay. All of them were pretty well behaved, except for the raffle. The raffle didn't work as well as we thought. But in terms of the categories that I mentioned here, all of them were roughly similar. We also asked questions about blame here, and it didn't seem to make much difference or to be much difference in the newlyweds and the kidney. Really? Now here was something interesting about the kidney one. So Julia's original example is with, it's not Alex's cousin, but Alex's brother. And so we were piloting some of these things in Colombia, and that was a no-go. It's like, if your brother asks you to donate a kidney, it's an obligation. So this is not, so we kind of moved to the cousin one to get a little bit of distance.
Yeah.
But maybe you might be the sort of person for which, cousin relations are just not that binding in that respect. I don't know if the sibling relation would do it for you. Mm-hmm. But I think that's one of the worries that we have with some of these situations is, but it's one of the interesting things about some of these situations that we think we're going to see a lot of cultural variations in many of these things. So a good example about is the amounts of money which you tip. So certain things are, there are certain tips that are insulting and certain tips that are way beyond what you, but that changes from one place to another. Yeah. Maybe speed limits also work like that. So I think there's a lot of, variations. So that's why it was important for us not to be the one selecting the examples, especially in the second part, but just letting people tell us what they thought were the ones that more resonated with them in terms of the distinctions between things that were wrong and impermissible and things that were wrong and permissible. But you're right. I think the kidney one, because it asks you about the value of this, kinship relations in one life can make a difference whether you think as, and maybe the cousin thing is not doing it for you. That's my punch there.
And one other, just along the lines, so in the super irrigation, I understand or make it, it's sort of intuitive why you would call that aspirational, but why would you think that, or why would you call the subarrogatory cases of aspirational norms, or is it just like you aspire to not to do that or something like that?
Yeah, so there are things that you might aspire to do, or there are norms that you might aspire to comply to those norms. But even though you think that non-compliance is not impermissible, you still think that there's something wrong about it. So it's the norm. It's not the behavior that you don't aspire to that behavior. It's kind of the norm that sets the difference between the aspiration and the protect. Yeah, that's it. Sorry if that was a little bit confusing.
I'll ask Marcel, okay?
No, first to chat.
So, yeah, next will be Thomas Naderhofer. Can you turn on your mic, please?
Yes.
Should I stop sharing?
That's up to you. Actually, I might like to see the slides, so you can leave it up for now.
Okay.
So first, let me say the talk was great. That was amazing. And the research program itself is very exciting. And I'm stoked that you're exploring these issues. As someone who's been teaching ethical theory and applied ethics for the last almost 20 years, I teach a lot of these concepts, and I use a lot of these very same vignettes. And it's sometimes hard to get students to make sense of their own intuitions. And so it's great that you're doing the work. I think it's great. So I had a suggestion, I guess, or like it's a worry coupled with a suggestion. The worry is partly predicated on what I just said, which is it's hard. If you give me if you say you give me 20 vignettes, which I think you did in one of these studies, and you basically give me a bunch of independent tuning knobs for the different component pieces of these things. One, it's very taxing. And it's also it's a challenging task. I think it would be a challenging task for me to balance like all these, if you have 3 different facets of the concept you're after, or 4, or in the first couple of cases, I think there'll be like 5 or 6. And so the worry is because you don't think they have the word, you're trying to give them the components of the concept. But one thing that you might try additionally, not necessarily instead, is you just force the concept by not using the word, and you say something like, they have multiple choices. Which of the following best captures what you think about Jamie's behavior? What Jamie did was good, and he deserves praise for doing it, but had he not done it, it would have been blameworthy. Or like, you build all that into statements, and then it makes it easier for them to, I think, parse what it is you want them to parse. And it also makes it easier from the standpoint of presentation, because you can just say, like, 20% of the people gave the obviously supererogatory answer, or 32% gave the answer that made it clearly obligatory. Does that make sense? It
makes total sense. So let me just say, so this was the sort of idea that drove us here in the first place. So we didn't want to impose people the categories that we wanted them to choose among, certain kinds of, certain categories. So I think on average here, people choose 3 different categories. They didn't 3 different words. I think that was what we saw. And we took these categories from the piloting that we had been doing before. There's more things that we can do with this kind of layout, because you can track, when people hover over a certain word and they don't choose it. Which, if we had, with eye tracking, we could see where people are looking and which words are calling their attention, and we can do a little bit of reaction time analysis. But again, I think we're on the same track. We're trying to let people tell us how they evaluate this sort of things. And it would be great if we were to have a little bit more different sort of methods that allow us to get at what people are thinking. So one of the things that I didn't mention, but I shall mention now, is that we always allow people spaces to comment and why they were, justifying, explaining. It's just very hard to go through, 700 answers trying to. But here's one thing that we found. And that's part of the direction where we're going. So a lot of characterological explanations. So Jamie was selfish. The person in the plane, he was a jerk. So we get a lot of those. And when we move to the well example, I mean the violin player example, and even so one thing that comes out is rights versus good things. So the person was a jerk for not giving up his seat, but it was within his rights. So that's something that we need to explore more. We are finding ways of trying to go through that bunch of qualitative data, and that should frame the way we're going to be addressing some of the questions that I mentioned at the end. But yeah, that's definitely helpful, and that's what we should be trying to do. Thank you.
Yeah, it wasn't somebody. It was just another thing. It was another way of getting at what I thought you guys were already doing. It was mainly just like, if you want to do between subject studies and stuff like that, more of that, you might be able to do some of that stuff. But like I said, I want to make sure you stay in touch with me so I can follow.
Please, yes.
The programs. It's amazing. I'm really like, I think it's a great thing you're doing. So keep it up.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, sure.
Walter, do you hear us? Walter?
Yes. Can you hear me?
So, yeah, very well. So please jump in the debate.
Hello, Walter.
Cool. Great talk, Santiago. As always, very clear and inspiring, and raises lots of issues. I wanted to ask whether you found individual differences. So to give you an idea of what I have in mind, take your own example of donating your kidney to save your brother. I think some people would say that's not supererogatory. That would be wrong not to do that, but other people would not. I have friends who say you're required to vote in elections, and others who say it's a good thing to vote, but you don't have to. And I've got environmentalist friends who say it's just wrong to drive your car when you could ride your bike. And others who say, look, it'd be better to ride your bike, but it's not wrong to drive. do you have any data that could explain those things? So I would imagine factors to look at would include things like religion. You know, there might be some religions who say you have to give a certain percentage of your income to the needy, and others who say, no, you don't have to, but it would be good. Maybe political orientation. It seems to me there are a lot of individual differences. Did you look at any of those in your data?
Good, thank you, Walter. So we didn't do an exhaustive search on individual differences. So we had some we have some demographical data of the folks that were participants in our studies. We have the usual, well, we have gender, we have in some of them, but not, we didn't collect systematically socioeconomic status. We did have some political inclination and we didn't find much difference. And we had some questions about the importance of norms for people's lives, and we didn't find significant differences there. I tell you one that we did where we found, we didn't quite find them. It's actually, so one of the things we did, and I didn't present here, was this. So we presented people with sacrificial dilemmas. And we asked them the same questions that we were asking here, seeing whether they were, seeing a little bit of distinction between what was morally permissible and what was permissible and obligatory. And it was flat, so we didn't find any differences there. But then when we started controlling and just, so we asked in that very same study, we asked people to fill in one of the utilitarianism scales, how utilitarian you are. And people who score very low on that scale would start showing some differences between the two things. I think is how the data went. So you might think that certain kind of moral attitudes do predict that you're going to find, and you're going to be more comfortable using those associations than not using it, at least in certain contexts. But no, we should explore that more. So do you have any suggestions as to what kind of traits might one will try to look at in order to see differences in how this, which kind of situations dissociate which kind of concepts?
Well, I think there might be, for example, the environmentalism one I mentioned, that there might be some people who are very strong environmentalists and behave in certain ways in their life. And now you ask them, is it wrong to drive your car when you could ride your bike? And I would think they would be more inclined to say wrong. But I think the obvious one is religion. Yeah. There's some religions that say, you have to tithe. You have to give that much money. And others say they're not. So I would look at religion, ideology, both political and environmental. And I'll bet you could come up with scenarios where they would give different answers. Now, the ones you have were not designed for that point. So it's not, you might not find them there. But I think, for example, gender might, in whether you have obligations to certain types of obligations to take care of children or parents. I think a lot of women feel obligated to do that, where men say, it'd be nice, but I don't have to let my parents, live with me. Of course, all those are generalizations and stereotypes, and I have no idea whether they would hold, but it'd be fun to try to design some scenarios that would bring out those individual differences.
Yeah, so let me tell you two ideas. So one thing that we are trying to work in the lab are tests to measure moralization in people. So some people moralize more certain topics and themes than other people. So that would be one that we might want to use here, whether degree of moralization actually affects the way you carve those distinctions. There's another one that I'm hoping that we do with Felipe, which is forgiveness, whether it's supererogatory or obligatory in certain cases. And I would bet that gender differences would place there. So there's robust data that women report having more forgiving dispositions than men. And that might be associated with views about forgiveness being obligatory versus it being imperatival.
Yeah,
That's
that'd be a
fine.
great one
That's-
to test. Yeah, I think there are a lot of these. Let's talk about it.
Cool, cool. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Yeah, cultural differences as
Yeah.
well. I'll read Marcelo Fishborn question. It was I bypassed him to give the word to Walter because I mean Marcelo cannot open the camera. He's taking care of toddlers, so I'm gonna read his question. Great talk, Santiago. I would like to ask first if it is a clear reading of your studies to say that the most clear sphere of application of moral responsibility is the pair of 1, violations of imperative norms, and 2, compliance with aspirational norms. Second question, do you think these results can be applied to our understanding of certain asymmetries, exemplia gratia noble effect? Maybe a more symmetrical view of plain praise will be found if the proper pairs of relations to norms were considered.
Question number 2, yes, but it's just a speculation. So one of the things that we need to do, and I think we're going to be doing in the next semester, is thinking about, there's a bunch of documented asymmetries in responsibility attribution and intentionality attribution, different asymmetries that are there. And I think some of the asymmetries might be explainable in terms of the distinction. I'm not sure if that's the case, but I have a hunch that at least some of them, some of which Marcelo mentioned, are going to be part of it. That's my answer to the second question. So speculation and compliance. To the first question, what was the first question? Sorry.
If the application of moral responsibility is based on the pair of 1, violations of imperative norms, and 2, compliance with aspirational norms.
So I think there is a difference in terms of violations and compliance. So when you have violations of imperatival, people think they deserve more punishment and more blame than when it comes to violations of aspirational. And when it comes to the positive ones, compliance with aspirational norms generates more praise. People deserve more credit than compliance with imperatival norms. So nobody becomes a saint for not lying or not cheating, as it were.
I think as Marcelo did the 2 questions in a row, I think it's taking as 2 premises, you know, they are kind of connecting. That's how I interpret his question. So I think your response is perfect because
Thank you.
it makes like 2 pairs of two ideas interrelated. Okay, so please, Marcel.
Yeah, I wonder to what degree the supererogatory overlaps with altruistic simply.
So in general, so whether supererogatory behaviors are the same as altruistic behaviors.
Yeah,
Or
to
at
what
least
degree
the
they
other way
overlap.
around. So I think there are, I'm not sure. And I'm pretty sure there are better ethicists in the room or in the Netherlands of Zoom that could answer this question. But I think there are altruistic behaviors that are motivated by duty. And I think there might be duties to be towards others that might yield altruistic behaviors. So in that sense, not all altruistic behaviors are supererogatory. Okay. I think just conversely, that not all selfish behaviors are suberogatory. some of them are impermissible. Okay. So it's a different sort of distinction, but there will be some overlaps for sure.
Okay, thanks.
Can I have a really fast follow-up? I would suggest use the big five traits of personality compared to that, because and then you get what Water asked for, some level of individuality considered. And at the same time, you can answer the kind of question Marcelo proposed, because using the big five traits scale of personality, you can measure extroversion, and that's kind of, let us say, traits of personality. They are related with empathy, for example. And we could see if we're talking here about duty or empathy, because I think those are completely different subjects, but both are playing a role here. Are you complying with duty, or are you being moved by a more basic emotional kind of empathy? It's just a suggestion.
Okay. I'll think about it. I mean, the big five predict everything, so that's why they're the big five, no? So you would expect to find something. Cool. Interesting. I mean, I don't know, but yeah, we should. Why not? We can try it.
Okay, great talk, Santiago.
Thank you.
Yeah, so back in the day before globalization and modernity, people lived within one moral system and then could ground what they thought was good and bad in something that was relative to that culture, some sort of absolutist framework like the will of God. But one consequence of modernity and globalization is that it has been the rise of a kind of moral relativism. So for example, in one culture, it's okay to behead people or stone them to death for adultery. And in their framework, that might even be the will of God. Whereas in ours, that's immoral. And so this is a fundamental problem of modernity, is moral relativism. I wonder if you're opening the door to more moral relativism by grounding the supererogatory and the suberogatory relative to what is permissible or impermissible or obligatory or not, because what is obligatory or not can change within days. So for example, an American sniper the day before the war ended, who killed a German soldier, might be good and obligatory or even laudatory, but the day after the war, the identical act might be regarded very differently. And I can come up with lots of examples like that. Slaves the day before they were emancipated, to give them shelter in the South might have been considered bad, but the day after emancipation might have been considered good. And so if you're dealing with something incredibly dynamic, like what society regards as permissible or impermissible or obligatory or not, I worry that you're opening the door to even more moral relativism than just regarding good versus bad.
Okay, so there are several things there. So are we opening the door to relativism? I don't think we're opening the door to, I don't think we're allowing in more relativism that there's already there. Okay, so the recommendation is not necessarily normative. I'm just saying this is the way we evaluate people. I do think that there are 2 points in your question that I want to comment on. So one of the things is change, and that's something that we want to see. And that's something that is worth studying, whether when you find norms that are changing and moral systems that are changing, whether you see things that were in one category move to a different category. And I think that's a natural way of seeing how some of the core moral norms that constitute duties became to be such. Okay, and I think changes in regulation in countries help those processes of moralization. Okay, so drinking and driving is forbidden. It was suberogatory when my parents were driving me to parties. It was bad, but maybe not forbidden. So I think that's one really interesting question that we need to think more about, whether how do things move from one domain to another. So one thing that we can do there is to use Walter's suggestion, because attitudes towards meat eating are changing, and we find in the same families, you know, the elders who just don't think there's an issue there, and the younger students who do think that there's a big issue there. It's not just subrogatory, but even impermissible to some of them. So we can try to study that. So I think that's good. That's a good thing to think about and to be reminded of. There's another thing about, so what's the function? How do these two systems came about? And we don't have yet a clear answer, but I suspect that it has to do with the fact that some societies grow bigger. So once societies start growing bigger, there's certain things that I wish I could require from others, but I'm not requiring from others, but I still want to say that it's bad, those things. Okay, so our last set of questions were trying to get at that. So maybe you think that giving up your seats is not obligatory. So you don't think that it should be required for everyone. You think people have a right, they bought their seats, but you don't want to be friends with a person who doesn't give up his or her seat for no cost, just because it was her right. So I think that the distinction between the imperatival and the aspirational might be due to the fact that some of our societies and moral communities just grew larger. Now we have at least a chance of testing this hypothesis next year. So we're going to be working with small community in the Amazon. They're mostly hunters and gatherers, and they're very small communities. And you might think that if something like this is true, then you should expect less of distinctions between what the super and the subrogatory in that kind of community. It's a big if, because we still need to develop materials that are ecologically valid, culturally valid, and we need this stupid bug to be over to be able to visit those communities. But yeah, that's a good line to pursue. Thank you.
Thank you for the great talk. I was thinking back to the example of the meat and the robbery, and it seems to me that one thing that differentiates them is that on one side you have one thing that you have clear rules, like robbery. You cannot rob because you have laws against it. So I may not rob, not because I believe that robbery is wrong, but because I don't want to go to jail. I was helping a friend in a research on psychopaths, and we were interviewing them, and they just like, do you believe that killing is wrong? Yes. Why? Because I got caught. I got to jail. Not because if it wasn't illegal, that would be okay. And the other side, you have things that require commitment. So it's not illegal to eat meat, but I'm committed to an ideal or to a way of life. So I have like this, like I said, emotional dispositions. And sometimes to follow a moral norm, it requires you to break the law. So you need to have a stronger commitment. For example, slavery. For a long time, slavery was legal, but people who fought slavery to a certain time, they were outlaws. So they have like this higher commitment to something. So is this something that we might broadly classify to differentiate these things you're trying to do? Like, for example, if robbery was legal and I decided to not rob on Mondays, people say, oh yeah, that's nice. You're not robbing. The same way you say, oh, that's nice, you're not eating meat. And if some generations from now, you'll just say about the idea of change, if either becomes illegal to eat meat or as a value in society, we share that eat meat is unpermissible, this might change sides, this idea. So I might have different rules in different societies about what's right and what's wrong, but it might seem we have a general disposition to that do no harm. What would be harmful might change at some ways, but the idea of do no harm seems to be more or less universal. So is this something that we can use to make this differentiation?
Okay, so I have so many things to say that I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to touch on all the aspects of the question, which is, lots of questions, very interesting. So here's one thing. So I don't think legal systems can explain everything that we want to explain here, because there are certain violations that are violations of imperatives that are not illegal. Okay, so you can lie to your partner, and that's not necessarily illegal, but it's kind of a violation of an imperative. I do think, and that was part of my answer to Peter's question.
Like a violation of the contract.
That was let me just but in my answer to Peter, I was telling him, no, I mean, I think legal systems can help us explain why certain things shape up in one way or the other. And I think that's clearly the case. I think that it is more likely that things that get codified by our legal systems as impermissible are not going to be part of our super or subrogatory. Okay, that's so, and the law, one way of looking at what the law does is to codify what are general agreed requirements, moral requirements among the population. Okay, at least insofar it is possible for a state to codify those things. So I think there's an interesting relation there. Now there's a whole issue that I didn't talk about, a whole set of issues which have to do with motivation. And I think you're absolutely right in what you say. I think there's a philosophical and psychologically interesting notion of commitment that we should be able to explore here. And that's going to be key to the differences and to explain why is it that certain people, go beyond the call of duty, as it were. I like that. And I wish, I could say more things about commitment in that regard. So that kind of commitment is not just desiring, it's kind of aspiring. So Agnes Keller has this book on aspiring, and she's talking about slightly different things. But I think she has something right. Just aspiring is coming to value certain things, where value is not just merely desiring it. And I think that might be part of the, the philosophical and psychological story as to what motivates people to go beyond the call of duty. So those are at least three aspects of your question that I hand wave at.
Well, wanna ask a big round of applause for the brilliant presentation of Santiago Amaya.
Well, thanks to all of you and all the people who are still in Zoom. Thanks a lot.
I want to give you a good news. Pfizer just released his report, and it seems that the booster shot, the third shot, neutralizes Omicron. That was released like 2 hours ago or something like that. I think that's good news.
Okay, we're gonna go and listen to some samba tonight.
Yeah. You're safe, you're protected with a third shot, with a booster shot. If you have 3 shots of Pfizer, you're fine. I mean, Pfizer is not giving me any money. I just animated to tell this news.